This is going to be a fun evening. My name is Dr. Stephanie Nielsen, and I am a provider with the DNA company. And tonight we're going to talk about the role of histamine in autoimmune diseases. Now, this was a topic that you guys decided on. We send out surveys when we're done with a lot of our talks, and we say, what would you like to hear about? And we kept hearing histamines, histamines, histamines. So I have with me tonight a dear friend and the head of our DNA University, Dr. Lara Varden. And we're going to talk about histamines. And this is the first time here at the DNA company that we've spent much time on histamines for our population. So, hi, Lara. How are you tonight?
I'm doing quite well. Thank you, Stephanie. How are you doing?
I'm doing great.
Excellent.
So we've got a lot of people here who are interested in the role of histamines and particularly in autoimmune disease. So we are going to go through a little bit of the background of histamines, a little bit of what histamines do or supposed to do, ways to control histamines, DNA and genes that play a role in histamines. And then, as always, we really invite you to put questions in, and we will have questions at the end where we will get to chat about answering your questions and see what we've got to do. Okay. So Lara, do you want to kick off with what is this thing called histamine and why is it important?
Well, okay. So histamines, I'm sure you all have heard of it before, but may not know exactly what they are. Well, they are, okay, here's a little sciencey words, organic nitrogenous compounds. Okay, that just basically kind of tells us some of the chemical structure that are involved, that, they've got, carbon, and they've got nitrogen, and all of these other wonderful things. But really, what they are molecules that are involved in various physiological functions in the body, particularly in immune responses, inflammation, and allergic reactions. They are really important because they act as chemical messengers that play a key role in the immune response, in cells like mast cells, if you've ever heard of those. They're larger cells that can be found, throughout the body and in the tissues, as well as basophils, which you may have heard of. They are part of the white blood cells, and you can find them if you ever have a CBC with differential, a complete blood count with differential, where the differential part means that they're looking at the specific white blood cells. Well, basophils are one of them. And when these mast cells and basophils encounter some sort of allergens or pathogens, they initiate this inflammatory response. And what it does is it helps to gather other immune cells and other activity to kill those allergens, those pathogens. So they actually play a very important part. We just don't want them going crazy.
And I think you make a really, really good point. So a lot of us don't realize that histamines are really our friend. So we think of them as being horrible, but histamine is used in contraction of smooth muscle. It's used in acid secretion in the stomach. It's used to lower your blood pressure, and it's used to stimulate brain activity to keep the brain going. So we've got to have histamine. So we've got to make sure that we have histamine balance in all things. It's kind of this teeter-totter, okay? So we've got to have the right balance. So histamine has good uses. The problem is when we have a toxic environment or when we have a toxic internal environment, the histamines get overactive. And as Dr. Lara said, they over recruit, overperform, and then they cause a lot of symptoms, symptoms such as watery eyes and wheezing, and coughing and redness and itchiness. So a lot of people say, when they think, oh, I've got all these histamines, I have all these allergies, these are the symptoms they think of. Excuse me.
You
And
know, I
go
do
ahead.
want to mention that, you know, histamines are really important in regulating other bodily functions. They're involved in regulating the sleep-wake cycle in the brain, which, you know, we'll talk about as well. It also works with the gastric acid secretion in the stomach, as well as neurotransmission, because they act as a neurotransmitter. So, I mean, I don't think a lot of people really appreciate or even, you know, realize how much histamines do for our bodies.
do beneficially and not that they are the enemy. Right.
Correct.
Right. So 50 million Americans have allergies and are taking something that is an antihistamine or that blocks histaminic activity. 50 million out of 300 million. This is just the US, not even including Canada. I mean, if we talked about that, it's like, oh my goodness gracious. That means we have a lot of histamine dysregulation. And we can go into that a little bit more about how that could be and why that comes about. But let's talk a little bit about the genetics of histamine and what happens. So, genetically, what happens with histamine and where can people look to get more information about their DNA as related to histamine and allergies?
Well, let's first say where they can get more information. Obviously, here at the DNA company, we do report a handful of genes that help to break down and regulate histamines. But there are a couple, actually, two main genes that create enzymes that break down histamines that we don't report, you know, that are very important. But the good thing is that the ones that we do, they are actionable. They are something that that you can take a look at. You can see if you are dysregulated and where you need the support to help with these genes, as well as, you know, laying the foundation for not having such a strong histamine response to allergies. Because I'll say that, like my husband used to have horrible allergies, you know, every spring and during hay, like hay fever. I mean, nose just running and just, you know, not feeling well. But by changing up diet, by, you know, helping to fix his sleep, by, you know, taking things like bee pollen from a local apiary. I remember he was on it for a little over 3 months. We hit into that hay fever season and he didn't have all of those symptoms. And he didn't even realize it until it was a good halfway through the season. He was like, oh my gosh, I'm not having all those symptoms. So it really is a multi-pronged approach, you know, to clean up the environment, support your system, etc. But let's jump back over into those particular genes. So histamine is broken down by two main enzymes. This is histamine and methyltransferase. So the gene that produces these enzymes is the HNMT gene. It's of the same name of the enzyme. The other one, the other enzyme is called diamine oxidase, and that's encoded by the AOC1 gene. And that is basically stands for aconitase 1. So these two genes, they really are the main histamine metabolizers, and genetic variants in these genes can actually impair that metabolism, leading to histamine intolerance. For example, say you have a variant in the HNMT gene that can actually reduce the enzyme's activity, slowing histamine degradation in tissues, where the DAO gene, that can actually result in a decrease of that enzyme and that activity in the gut, because there is a strong connection of histamines and gut, and that can lead to systemic histamine accumulation. Now, the genes that we report in our DNA 360 reports, these include your glutathione conjugation genes, the GST genes. This family of enzymes are involved in the detoxification process, including the metabolism of histamines. We also look at the COMT gene, COMT. That also helps to break down neurotransmitters. So we're talking like catecholamines, dopamine, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and histamines in the brain and nervous system. So obviously, any variations of these genes are going to cause whether it's a buildup of histamine because COMT is slow and you're not breaking them down as quickly, but also with the GST genes. Say you have 0 copies of your GST T1, you could experience reduced histamine breakdown that could exacerbate intolerance as well as autoimmune related inflammation. There we go. And then with like the GSTM1 gene, say you have 2 copies and you think, oh, well, isn't that, the optimal? I happen to have 2 copies myself. But what can happen is that can lead to over aggressive detoxification activity. And that can actually contribute to heightened immune responses and further complications in autoimmune conditions. And then, of course, our GSTP1.
Well, hold on. You got a lot of letters for a lot of people. I'm going to slow down and break a few of these up. Okay. So the first that we started with, for those of you who are taking notes, those of you who are familiar with the DNA company, the HNMT, the N-methyltransferase, the histamine, we do not report that one. So if you're looking for that on your report, you're not going to find it. The AOC1, we do not report that. Those are 2 that are key. But remember, at the DNA company, we do actionable genes that we can see before, that we can see after. We can have somebody have, this is my symptom, we have a result. So those are not 2 that we report, but there are ways to test those, okay? Now, not with us, but with others. So with the ones we do carry, as Dr. Lara said, we do report the COMT, we do report the GST. And as she said, when you look at those detoxification, when you look at those clarification, especially because tonight is histamine and autoimmune disease, and this is where she's going into her brilliance, you can have too much of a good thing. And as she said, the 2 of the GSTT can cause, again, autoimmune. I'm autoimmune. Dr. Krista's autoimmune. I think all of us here came from this place of like, why can nobody fix me? And then we dug in and we go, oh, because we have all these funky gene mutations,
And if I can just clarify, it's actually the over aggressiveness is on the GSTM as in Mary 1. That really works a lot with the gut. And like I said, I have 2 copies of that. And I have dealt with autoimmune issues like psoriasis and things like that. That is, or those are physiological presentations that can be seen with 2 copies of the GSTM1. But if you have 2 copies of the GST as in Tom 1, that's actually very beneficial. That actually helps, with that, with the clearance of toxins, et cetera, and the breakdowns. It's when you have 0 copies that can definitely be problematic. And I've had plenty of clients with 0 copies.
That would be me. So interesting. There is a 3rd gene that we report that people don't even associate with histamine intolerance. Can you talk to us about that one?
Yes, that would be the clock gene. And the clock gene you will actually find in your sleep report because it works with your sleep-wake cycle, the circadian rhythm. And every cell, every tissue in the body, every organ has that circadian rhythm. It is really absolutely amazing because an interesting fact is that histamine levels, and we're talking normally, not people who are really dysregulated or having issues, just normally histamine levels rise and fall throughout the day according to the circadian rhythm of the mast cells. I mean, it really is just absolutely fascinating. I mean, one of the areas that I studied in grad school that I have my PhD in is neuroscience. So, anything having to do with the brain and looking at neurotransmitters and how this works. And like I said earlier, histamine acts as a neurotransmitter and is associated with that wakefulness. I mean, when you're talking about neuroinflammation with altered circadian rhythms of histamine release, that can be a cause for early morning insomnia. It's actually sometimes called histamine dumping. So, because when histamine rises in the morning, it's almost like the same type of pattern of cortisol, except that it actually rises a little bit earlier in the morning than cortisol, and it will start, going down. That can actually wake you up. So, for example, let me ask you, Stephanie, do you wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning, unable to go back to sleep?
I can go back to sleep, but yes, I do.
Okay, so that could be high histamine levels in the brain.
Mhm,
Like that histamine dump that I was talking about.
mhm.
And it's really interesting because, when and in research, on histamine, mast cells, circadian rhythms, melatonin, neuroinflammation, these are really intertwined to cause that early morning insomnia, that dreaded, 3, 4 a.m. wake up.
Mhm.
So, when we talk about the clock gene, we really need to know, do you have a regular sleep wake cycle presentation, which would be a TT version? Or are you dysregulated? Is there a C in there? I happen to have a C. I have a CT presentation for my clock gene. So I am dysregulated. Um, you know, but thankfully, even if you are dysregulated in that clock gene, there are ways to help make it easier, and we're going to be talking about some of those things, actually, several of those things that you can do to help your body, to get rid of toxins, to help re-regulate your circadian rhythm, even if your clock gene is dysregulated.
And before we do that, let's pull up our poll so we can look and see who our audience is and really clue in on the things they're looking for. So if we have our magic poll, there it is. So our first question, I'm going to move this just a little bit. There we go. What's your current level of knowledge? 24% no knowledge, 50% basic understanding, 21% intermediate knowledge, and 5% advanced. Well, I will tell you, if you are intermediate or advanced, then you may not have something on Lara, but you do on me. I've had a lot of allergies as a kid. I was a medical researcher and did histamine 2 blocking agents, and particularly in the gut, Zantac. But as I was digging in to learn for the role tonight, you know what? There's a lot more to histamine. So we really welcome your participation. Have you ever experienced symptoms that could be linked to histamine intolerance? Yes, frequently, 34%, and occasionally 64% or 46%. I would wonder on those occasional or if those are seasonal, because I do know throughout the US and throughout different areas of the country, there are, the spring allergies or the fall allergies or when pollens are high. Um, but if you put those two together, I mean, we're looking at a good 80% of the population has had, and that goes quite along with the 50 million people that have regular allergic responses. Do you or have a personal or family history of autoimmunity? 37% said yes, personal, 19% said family, so we're getting at 57 to 60%. 30% says no, and another 15% says they're not sure. And then what's the primary reason? To learn more about histamine and autoimmune conditions. And so we're going to start talking about that clock gene. We're going to start talking about how to lower or appropriate histamine throughout the body, things that you can do. What we know about genes, genes are not a death sentence. A lot of people think, oh my gosh, I've got a bad gene, therefore I will get X. Not true. You regulate your environment, you regulate your foods, you regulate your stress levels. There's a lot of things that you have in your hands to empower you. And that's what we hope to share with you tonight are things that you can do using your genes, using your environment to lower your autoimmunity and lower your histamine effects on that. What did you learn from that, Lara?
For which part? Because I mean, there's so much to learn.
Well, I
There's,
mean, just about our audience and their interests and that their participation in.
I mean, first of all, I have to say that I have been so impressed by our audience members. They are so engaged, that we have this beautiful spectrum, of those who have some information, who, are dealing with situations and are looking for more education. What else can I do? What haven't I tried? What have I been doing right? Maybe what have I been doing wrong? It's the engagement and the interactiveness of our audience. I am just blown away by them. I learn by them every day, and it's just amazing. I did notice something, a question in the Q&A that I do want to answer right now.
Okay.
Barb had asked what reports in the DNA 360 are most relevant right now. So for this webinar, the reports that you'll want to look at is your anti-inflammation report. You can look at your sleep report, and you'll notice in your sleep report, that's where you'll see the clock gene. But you'll also notice in the sleep report, you have all of your detox pathway genes too, because they all affect that. I mean, if you want to talk about looking at your brain, okay, looking at, your dopamine, your COMT. Well, COMT you'll see throughout. A COMT you will see in the sleep report. You'll see in anti-inflammation, but you'll also see it in mood and behavior. So, and, so definitely take a look at those. I know you're going to kind of be bouncing around, but you'll see these genes repeated throughout because they impact all of these systems so significantly.
Exactly. So when we are looking at autoimmunity, the immunity is really important. And I'd like you to go back through again, immunity, autoimmunity, and things that people need to be aware of for immune support with histamines.
So, okay, so you're asking me where in the reports for the immune? I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, just so that they can jump in to their reports. What I tell people to do is to take notes here, go
Mhm.
back and watch the replay, because we're going to be sending a replay. We're also going to be sending a cheat sheet on low and high histamine foods. We're going to be sending a cheat sheet on, some manipulations of histamine. But because we're also focusing on autoimmunity has to do with the whole immune system, and that immune system going a little rogue.
Exactly. So here, definitely the anti-inflammation reports, because that right there is covering all of your detox pathways, as well as your vitamin D, which is extremely important for gut health. Of course, I see the connectedness of all the things that also looking at your diet nutrition report. That's going to be very important because we are going to be diving in and talking about food, diet. Diet is a huge, can hugely impact how you react to the environment around you. It's going to set the stage. What gut bacteria are you feeding? What are the byproducts? How is this working? But also foods you may be allergic to or sensitive to. That can trigger the GI upset, the triggering an increase in histamines, but also the types of foods. There are foods that are high histamine foods. There are foods that are low histamine foods. And, I would like to take some time to be able to give people what some of those foods are.
Yeah, let's do that.
Oh, okay. Oh, let's jump into that. So,
Yeah.
high histamine foods. So, again, foods are categorized as high or low in histamines based on the content and how they trigger histamine release in the body. So, obviously, histamine-rich foods can worsen symptoms of people with histamine intolerance, while low histamine foods are generally safer for those managing any kind of histamine sensitivity. So, a list of high histamine foods. We're talking fermented foods like sauerkraut, kimchi, kombucha, miso, soy sauce, things like that. And I'm sure some of you are going, but wait, I thought fermented foods was really good for my gut. Yes, yes, they are. But for people with histamine intolerance, and high sensitivities, you're actually poking the bear. Okay. You actually are causing probably a little more damage than your body is able to handle. So there are other things that can be done. So just keep in mind, I'm just listing high histamine foods right now. Other high histamine foods, aged cheeses. Now this, thank God I'm not really histamine intolerant because I love my cheeses. So we're talking Parmesan, Gouda, cheddar, these aged cheeses, brie, again, high in histamines. Processed meats. So like salami, pepperoni, bacon, ham, smoked fish. These are all going to be higher in histamines, as well as alcohol, wine, especially red wine,
Chocolate.
and beer and champagne. It's like, again, people are like, but wait, I thought these things would be good for me in general, but not for histamine intolerance. Certain fish as well, mackerel, tuna, sardines, anchovies, shellfish. Now let's get into the vegetables. Okay, we're talking your tomatoes, spinach, eggplant, avocado. So, these types of vegetables are going to be higher in histamines. Fruits, more the tropical fruits. So we're talking pineapple, bananas, strawberries, papaya, some citrus fruits, oranges, lemons, limes, grapefruit, and like you said, chocolate. Oh, I love my dark chocolate. And then we get into nuts, cashews, walnuts, peanuts, things like that. And I'm sure you guys are going, oh my gosh, okay, so there.
Is there anything left?
Exactly. Thankfully, yes. Yes, there are. So this would be, okay, let's talk about meats. So remember how I said aged meats have usually higher histamines. Well, thankfully, fresh, unprocessed meats have lower histamines. So your beef, lamb, chicken, turkey, again.
Especially ruminants. So
Yeah.
the beef, lamb, venison, buffalo, elk.
Yeah. For fish, thankfully, there is some fish. So for those of you who don't eat meats, we're talking about fresh caught fish. Okay. Sole, trout, cod. Really try to avoid any canned or smoked varieties in this case. Eggs. Eggs are low histamine. Making sure that they are coming from, chickens that are free range, that aren't pumped full of, antibiotics or, all of that other junk. So, and it's really interesting because there are different varieties. Like if you've ever gone to the grocery store for the eggs, and it's like there's a cage free. It might say free range. It might say vegetarian fed. It might say organic. And you're like, what's the difference? And we're not going to get into all the variances of that, but really you want to look for organic. That's the word you want to look at. And there, it is usually a little more expensive, but if you can go to a farmer's market or someone who owns chickens that you know treat them well and feed them well, get them from there. It'll be cheaper, and then you also know the source.
Well, and I'll also tell you, I raise chickens. I got 24 chickens out back.
There you go.
And chickens are not vegetarians. So this vegetarian fed is ridiculous. So I don't have bugs in my yard because the chickens eat them. They eat bugs, they eat worms, they eat baby snakes. They will like run around and grab the snakes because I live out in the country. If I have leftover meats that, gristle and whatever, I take it out and give it to the chickens. The chickens are definitely omnivores. They love the grass, they love the grain. Do not look for soy and corn fed. That's just to plump them up. The oranger and redder your yolks are, the healthier they are. So while organic is great and that's ideal, free range and pasture raised. And if you can find somebody local that has backyard chickens, do that for sure.
Yeah. And oftentimes the organic will be free range. Pasture raised is just, again, you have to be a little careful, because if it just says free range, well, the wording, there are some companies that they get away with just letting them out in this like 2 foot by 2
All
foot.
they have to do is open the door, then they can free range, and then they call them free range.
Yeah. So it's not what we normally think it should be. We have to be careful about wording and knowing the true meaning of it. So,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, Dr. Stephanie, you can send eggs to everybody.
Yeah.
So back to low histamine foods, gluten-free grains, rice, quinoa, oats, millet, things like that. Most vegetables are low histamine. So we're talking leafy greens, cucumbers, carrots, zucchini, sweet potatoes, and really most fruits, apples, pears, blueberries, melons. Also some herbal teas are actually very good, like the chamomile, peppermint, rooibos. And then there's also dairy alternatives like coconut milk, almond milk, but avoid the fermented dairy. Another thing to note, leftovers.
Mhm.
You really want to eat up your leftovers within 1 to 2 days. You don't want to be eating anything in the fridge that's been sitting there 5 days, a week, or you're looking at it and you go, oh my gosh, when was the last time I cooked that? Don't eat it, because the longer something sits and is leftovers, the higher the histamine levels. And that's in like any food. Okay. Even more so in fish, leftover fish. So even though the fresh caught fish that I had mentioned is low histamine, if you let it sit as a leftover in the fridge, say 4 days later, histamine levels are going to be through the roof. You're not going to want to eat that. So you want to eat that fresh, not have any leftovers, or eat it the next day. Otherwise, don't eat it.
Also, overripe fruits. A lot of people will let things get a little too ripe or a little too mushy. Those would be higher in histamine.
Yep.
And that's going to trigger your reactions. Or if you have autoimmunity, it could trigger the autoimmunity to speed up and to be worse. Mhm.
So, yeah, I mean, really, you want to have and be mindful of these particular foods. Also, there is a great website. It's called What the Bleep Can I Eat.com. I love that site because, again, like we were talking about, all these things that were high in histamines. Oh, I can't eat that. What's left to eat? Now, I didn't read off all of the things that you can eat that are low histamine. That would take too long. If you go to that site, you can actually input, like check off a particular diet, therapeutic diet, low histamine, and it will list all the foods that you can eat, and it will give information about that. It's very well curated. So, definitely use that as a resource if you're a little stuck going, what the can I eat?
Yeah. So another thing that we can talk about is what the bleep can I use to lower histamines in my body besides antihistamines? Now, most of you know I'm a pharmacist, and so that people come in all the time. Should I use Zyrtec? Should I use Allegra? Should I use, Benadryl? Um, so I can tell you that certain antihistamines will make you sleepier than others. And that sleepiness goes back to the clock gene and to the histaminic activity. So some people use those for sleep. Short term, to use an antihistamine to sleep is fine. Long term, it's not, because we're drying everything up. Antihistamine needs to dry up. When you use an antihistamine, you can dry your eyes, you dry your nose, you dry your mouth, but you dry all of your bodily fluids, because histamine is throughout the whole body. So things that you can use: quercetin. Quercetin is a natural antihistamine that can help block histamine through the body. Zinc, interestingly, when you increase zinc levels, we decrease IgE levels, immunoglobulin E. Now, immunoglobulin E is what stimulates anaphylaxis. So if we have higher zinc levels and you have an anaphylactic reaction, now we're not talking about anaphylaxis so much tonight as much as the autoimmunity, but knowing that having good solid zinc levels can help keep stabilization there. Turmeric is great, and especially the active ingredient curcumin is very anti-inflammatory for the body. And a big one, huge one, is probiotics. Now Lara was talking a little bit earlier about, the probiotics and gut health. I will tell you that there is so much research going in right now for all autoimmunity to show, can the body reduce these histamine loads, reduce these inflammatory components? And a lot of it is based on gut health. So there is the probiotic foods such as kimchi and sauerkraut, but in this case, those would not be a good choice. Lara, let's talk about probiotics for a minute. Do you have a preference on how people use their probiotics, or which probiotics they use, or what do you think about probiotics?
Well, first of all, I love probiotics. And to answer the first part of your question, which ones do I have them use? Which ones do I prefer? That depends. It depends on the person. It depends on what is their genetic predisposition that we're looking at. I also want to know, what is their environment? What are they being exposed to? What factors? So you have like your antecedents, the genes, okay, that they are set up with, but what triggering factors got them to have a dysregulated gut in the first place, for why they would need probiotics, or they would need to shift their gut population. I definitely like to have, I don't like to go blind. I like to test. I like to see. So I have people take our gut 360 test, so I can actually see what is in their gut. That is really important. I need to know, what is our starting point? What is our diversity? What's the phyla like? Or do they have a lot of inflammation, their proteobacteria being off the charts or something? How many beneficial keystone bacteria do they have or not have, as the case may be for several people? What do they have for the pathogenic species that we have to deal with? Because if you've got someone, not very good beneficial bacteria, and they are super high in E. coli, well, we got to deal with that E. coli right away. And there's certain protocols, very specific protocols, that can help with that. Same with Candida. If they are high in Candida, now that really needs to be dealt with to help balance the gut, so everything else can be balanced, because your immune system comes from your gut. It dictates that. And your gut-brain axis, that connection, extremely important, which I've already mentioned, a few times. So there's definitely important aspects when it comes to probiotics that I want to see what are we working with, so I know where to target that treatment or that the particular blend of probiotics that I would, recommend to someone. And there are several probiotics that I like. We offer in our Black Label blend a whole suite of probiotics. So it doesn't have everything. We don't have Akkermansia muciniphila. Not to say we won't be able to add it into our blend at some point, but if someone needs that, Akkermansia as a keystone species, plus others, then I may give them our Black Label blend along with an Akkermansia.
And I wanted you to notice what she said. She talked about 17 different species. We have hundreds and hundreds of species in our gut, not just one. It's not just Lactobacillus acidophilus. Everybody thinks if I have Lactobacillus acidophilus, if I have a little bit of sugared yogurt, I have a little strawberry yogurt every morning, I'm fine. Wrong. That with all those hundreds of things, you need bifidus and you need bifidum and you need Saccharomyces boulardii and you may have Akkermansia and you're like, I've never even heard these names. If you've got an unresolved condition, if you have not addressed your gut, if you've not looked at your gut, that may be a place for you to start, because that dysregulation. So if you've ever been on antibiotics, if you've had frequent antibiotics, what will happen is that dysregulation sets up dysbiosis, and the dysbiosis then causes the out of control. So many of you know that I had cancer at the age of 21. Well, I was the sick, allergic kid. I was skinny, teeny, couldn't gain weight, had all sorts of allergies, and they'd put me on an antibiotic every time I'd have an allergic reaction. So I would have 2 weeks of being well, 2 weeks of getting sick, antibiotic, 2 weeks of being sick, get well, 2 weeks of being well, and go through. I would have 8 to 11 rounds of antibiotic a year. Let me tell you, I'm in my 60s now, and my gut has never been fully back into action. And so by having the gut biosis and then having a gut test and look and see, what am I high, what am I low, it's kind of like planning out a diet. I mean, what foods do I need to eat? What minerals do I need? What vitamins do I need? You really can get a lot more handle on your overall health and your autoimmunity and your histamines by allowing your body to get what it needs to bring itself back into balance. So I agree with you. And I think it's critical that people understand there's prebiotics, probiotics, and postbiotics. And so you've got to lay this right environment to pull your body out of autoimmunity. Now, I was an undiagnosed celiac. Once we diagnosed that, change the diet. What did Dr. Lira talk about? She talked about changing the diet. So changing the gut, changing the diet, and then cleaning up those habits in your environment so that you can lower the inflammation and do a lot of the processing is going to be really critical for your journey. So, Lara, what else do we need to know before we dive into some of these questions? Because we have a lot of questions to go through.
Yes. I would say one of the main things that people need to know, and I want to have as one of the key takeaways from this webinar, is that one of the most important things is reducing your exposure to histamine triggering factors. And whether that is foods, whether it's stress, environmental allergens, infections, whatever the case may be, the mitigation, the lowering of the exposure has got to be first and foremost. Otherwise, you're constantly trying to play catch up. It's like, yes, we can support your system. We can support the detoxification pathways. We can support sleep and all this other stuff. But if you are filling your bucket, your toxic bucket, faster than you're emptying it, you're fighting a losing battle. Slow that fill so that way you can start emptying it more quickly. and stop triggering, stop poking that histamine bear, that, to get those reactions. Let's get that lowered, and then everything else kind of starts to settle down.
Great. So let's move into some of our questions. Some of them I think we've already answered, but we'll reiterate a few of them, and then we'll try to get in to more specific. So first of all, Stephanie Naftel says, I don't see anything on my report about the histamines. Can you point me in the right direction? So remember, Stephanie, we talked about the GST genes, the clock gene, and the comp genes. Those are the genes that do kind of the clear and detoxification, and Dr. Lara did a beautiful job going through those. The AOC1 and the HN, let's see, I wrote it down so that I could look. The HNMT1, those we do not report. If you've ever done another test, then you can find those maybe on some of those. However, you can influence those, like the AOC1 makes that DAO, and DAO can be taken as a supplement. That if you're having those reactions, you can look into DAO and see if that's appropriate for you, and be able to use that to lower that histaminic activity.
And I do want to mention the methylation pathway is very important. Okay. And COMT actually is the end player for the methylation pathway. So, if you can support your methylation, with your B vitamins, dark leafy greens, eating the foods and lowering the stress and doing all these things, that is going to be beneficial for you. I do want to comment on Jennifer had said about, having to do a lot of batch cooking, larger things, cooking for the week. And, she had written the question before I had talked about leftovers and higher histamine levels. But one of the things she asks is, okay, so how do I avoid the increased histamine levels in leftovers, but still do food prep for the week ahead? What you do, you make your batch and you freeze it. So when I'm talking about higher histamine levels, I'm talking about those that are left on the counter, if it doesn't need to be refrigerated necessarily, or it's in the refrigerator for a week, the histamine levels are going to go up much more quickly. If you freeze it, it slows that down. So it can provide the extension, of the lower histamine levels in the foods that you are making. So, for example, I'll make a batch of these mini quiches where I will do, put some nice quality grass-fed and finished beef or sausage or something like that, and vegetables, eggs. Yes, I do put some cheese, but you don't have to put cheese. I put them in the, the muffin size. I make like individual quiches instead of the big pie dish. Okay, so I do that. And then, after they've cooled enough, I wrap them and I freeze them. And then we just take them out, throw them in the oven to heat them up and eat it throughout the week. So as much as you can, freeze, or if you are making certain dishes, just make sure if you put it in the fridge that you eat it up within, a few days. Don't let it sit for a week. So it's just kind of reinventing different ways to cook. So, and that answers not just Jennifer, that's for everybody.
Yeah. I also know that when I was doing big batch cooking, I would like do all my chopping and freeze some of my veggies raw instead of cooked. And then I could take those out before I left for work and let them thaw so that they were thawed, and I could whip them together that night. So you still had the prep, but they hadn't been cooked and weren't technically leftovers. So if you're stir frying, or if you can throw something into a crock pot or some that way, that may be a helpful way to avoid having it all cooked and then, getting that histamine levels. So,
Yeah.
okay. So then, I think it's pronounced Fausia, So Fazia says, what is the relation to histamine intolerance and our nervous system dysregulation?
Okay, so that actually really works with the nerves, the neurotransmitters, and as far as the intolerance. Okay, let me go back to how histamine is a neurotransmitter. Okay, so like I said, it plays a role in that sleep wake cycle, as well as cognition and mood. It primarily acts through the H1, H2, H3, and H4 receptors. Okay, so there's those four receptors in the central nervous system. When histamine levels are too high due to some sort of intolerance, it can actually disrupt normal brain function, leading to things like anxiety, headaches, brain fog, sleep disturbances. Um, so, within the nervous system, because again, the nervous system is works on sleep and wakefulness. um, you know, Seeing that histamine is heavily involved in maintaining wakefulness, elevated histamine levels can cause things like I had mentioned earlier, the insomnia. It can also cause fragmented sleep patterns. And it's that dysregulation of the H1 receptors that can actually lead to the excessive stimulation, resulting in that difficulty of falling asleep or staying asleep. So that obviously affects the circadian rhythm. Uh, Trying to think. Let's. How about stress? Because remember, one of the things that I had mentioned, in order to lower your histamine reactions, one of the lifestyle things is lowering your stress levels, or being
Right.
able to, manage that stress, because high levels of histamine can actually increase the release of stress hormones like cortisol and exacerbate anxiety. Uh,
So deep breathing, meditation, exercise, all can
Grounding
help. Mhm.
outside,
Yep. Get
do
your
some
feet
Shinrin
on.
Yoku,
Yep. Yeah.
forest
Um,
bathing.
a- and that actually leads to the second part of Fazia's question, which does inhaling pure oxygen help some people with histamine intolerance, especially maybe cluster headache groups, where everyone seems to be histamine intolerant mast cell activation syndrome. Nobody's actually been diagnosed, but he said it's an off label that they use oxygen and it helps to decrease.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, it can relieve some symptoms of histamine intolerance because it works on the effects of histamine induced hypoxia. Hypoxia meaning reduced oxygen levels in the tissues. And what Stephanie, you had said this earlier about histamine allowing for vasodilation.
mhm.
Okay, lowering the blood pressure, because as it causes these blood vessels to dilate, um, it can actually lead to decreased blood pressure, reduced oxygen delivery to the tissues. That can cause people to be dizzy, fatigued, headaches, things like that. So pure oxygen actually helps to increase the amount of oxygen available in the bloodstream, thereby like compensating for that reduced oxygen delivery.
So another trick you can do is beets is a low histamine food, but beets also produces nitric oxide. So there's beet powder you can use, there's nitric oxide capsules you can use. When you increase that, you get that vasodilatation, you're going to have an increased oxygen ability to the body. I love to use to improve oxygen in the body and to flush toxins out of the body. I like to use PEMF. So if any of you have ever had a PEMF mat, stands for pulsed electromagnetic frequencies. Those are good for pushing oxygen and nutrients deeper in the tissues and flushing out the toxins and the inflammatory components. And that can really help with headaches or rashes or things where everything's been stuck because everything's locking down. So, and I have seen a lot of my clients that have had autoimmunity issues, actually improve more rapidly with all the other things they're doing, because it just pushes all the nutrients deeper into the tissues and allows them to remove the other inflammatory components.
Yeah, I wanted to mention specifically because, he had said about the mast cell activation.
Mhm,
With oxygen therapy, HBA or something like that,
mhm.
um, the oxygen can actually indirectly stabilize mast cells. And, for people out there, I had mentioned about mast cells are actually responsible for releasing histamines. So obviously that can improve tissue oxygenation, reducing oxidative stress, etc. So,
Exactly. So one of our next questions is, which is the clock gene?
okay. So the clock gene is the one, like I said, it's found in the sleep systems report.
Right.
And that is responsible for your sleep wake cycles. Dr. Sachin Panda from the Salk Institute actually has done amazing research on the clock gene and how that works and the circadian rhythm. So it really, and actually the clock, it's not, it actually doesn't stand for like the clock face that you read time from. Clock actually is an acronym. It stands for circadian locomotor output cycles kaput. So, I mean, I just think that's so cool.
It is cool, but the other thing is, a lot of people think of the clock gene only as sleep. But if you look at traditional Chinese medicine, they have a medicine chart of the times during the day that organs will detoxify or run or clean, kind of like your washing machine comes on in the middle of the night, or your coffee machine comes on because you programmed it in the morning. Each organ has a different place on the clock, and things like a pancreas has a clock gene in it, and they release certain amounts of insulin at certain different times of the day. Our kidneys have clock genes, our adrenal glands have clock genes. So clock
I like
genes are
that.
all over the body to do different things at different times of the day. And that's really how a big part of how we function. So it's fascinating. All right. I have multiple DAO SNPs and 2 slow PEMT. I take DAO with meals and was going to ask what to do for the PEMT. Histamine is good for your alertness. Yes, that was somebody who paid attention in the beginning. Histamine actually protects your brain and helps your brain be a little bit sharper. I'll be real honest, I don't know about the PEMT. Lara, do you?
Yeah. Okay. So the PEMT, this gene is responsible for converting, this is a mouthful, phosphatidylethanolamine into phosphatidylcholine. A lot of you have heard of phosphatidylcholine, okay, which is crucial for liver health, cell membrane integrity, lipid metabolism, things like that. So a slow PEMT activity can actually lead to lower levels of phosphatidylcholine. And that can contribute to things like fatty liver disease, poor bile production, and other metabolic issues. Some strategies. So ways that the PEMT function can be supportive. And again, I do want to say the information that we are giving is for educational purposes only. I'm not saying that, Stephanie, this is, or whomever had asked this, Cindy, this is what you should be doing, because I'm not your clinician. This is
Yeah, she maybe have a doctorate, but she's not your doctor. That's what
that's
she's trying to
true.
say.
So I do offer that this information is based on research, is based on, educational information that you can take back to, your doctor and talk to them about, hey, can we look into this? So diving in, things that you can support the PEMT would be increased choline intake. Because remember the phosphatidylcholine, since PEMT gene supports that choline synthesis, people with a slow PEMT variant often can benefit from choline intake. So look for choline-rich foods, eggs, liver, fish, soybeans. Um, but again, also being mindful that some of these things, whether, because I said fish, there's some fish that are high histamine, other fish that are not. So being careful not to poke that histamine bear. Um, Other
And
things.
remember, on the replay, you can go back and take notes, and we're going to send out a handout that has high histamine, low histamine. Use a highlighter. Go back. This is really a chance for you to do self-study. You are an experiment of one. Some people can handle, a little bit of maybe some apple cider vinegar, and some people can handle nothing fermented, So, yeah.
But a couple other things, it's a trimethylglycine can actually be very good because the betaine that has that can act as a methyl donor to support those methylation pathways, which I said were so important. Optimizing methylation, B vitamins, looking, and this is where our DNA report works very well because we can actually see which forms of B vitamins work best for you based on your genes. So those types of things you can look into.
And Lara, I don't know if you've seen some recent research. I'm one of those morning nerds that I have my morning coffee and I sit in bed and I read medical research. With methylation, I mean, everybody's talking about methylation, everybody's talking about MTHFR, but I've read some new research this morning that came out of the National Institute of Health that talked about the MTHFR may not be as damaging as we think. And in fact, it may be a lack of B2, that 86% of the population is deficient in B2, even though in general on a blood test it doesn't show up. But the higher levels of B2 that we have can actually help the function. Now, I have always used methylated Bs, so methylfolate and methylcobalamin and et cetera, et cetera. But there is some new research that says if you've got a faulty MTHFR, and we check more than just the MTHFR, but upregulating or upping in your intake, that B2, you may be able to trick that MTHFR to do what it's supposed to be doing. Have you read about that or heard about that?
Actually, no, I hadn't.
I
That's
will forward it to you tonight.
I would love that. Great. Keep me up. Because I won't want to be able to put it down.
Yeah, bedtime research.
Yeah, see, that doesn't put me to sleep, but that energizes
I
me.
know, I get excited too. That's why I do it in the morning. When my clock gene has said it's okay, time to get up and engage your brain.
Love.
Um, is it healthy to take antihistamines every day, or are there things that you should use, better ways to regulate the histamine in your body? So if you don't mind, I'll take that one.
Sure, go ahead.
As a pharmacist, I'm going to tell you that I would prefer that you use other things. The more natural you can go, the better. One, change your diet. Two, we talked about some supplements. We talked about the quercetin, the zinc, the turmeric, the probiotics. I did leave out a couple. One, stinging nettle has been showed in herbal medicine to be very beneficial in eliminating or reducing histamines. And Lara talked about the bee pollen, local bee pollen, raw honey. Um, it's interesting, even though the American Academy of Allergy and Immunology doesn't recognize local bee pollen, there have been plenty of studies that show placebo or cooked honey versus local raw honey. And the studies empirically show that within a couple weeks of that little bit, because it inoculates you, kind of like allergy um, shots, that inoculates you to the local pollens and helps with the histamine issues. So histamine, antihistamines like a Benadryl, like a Zyrtec, like an Electra, can be used. But remember, the whole antihistaminic activity is about a dehydration and pulling back. You'll dehydrate your eyes, you'll dehydrate your mucous membranes all the way down through. And in the long run, a long-term use of that is not your best friend. Short-term, no problem. Situationally, no problem. Probiotics, I really want you to go and look at getting your gut 360 done so that we can get that GI tract really, since it's 80% of your immune system, then we can really balance that out, and you will watch a lot of your symptoms subside or decrease dramatically. Let's
There's a
see. Go.
question from Amber. I saw that she asked, what would you recommend for me since I have 0 copies of both GST genes and my comp is AA, which is slow. Again, this is just more general information based on this, definitely check and do things with a provider that you are working with. But in general, for someone who has 0 copies of both their GST T1 and GST M1, again, this is the glutathione conjugation pathway genes. We do not recommend that you take a liposomal glutathione because your body really wouldn't know what to do with it. This is where the precursors come in. So this, we would offer that N-acetylcysteine, okay, because that is a precursor. Things like selenium, although I know certain nuts can be higher in histamine, but Brazil nuts have wonderful, very high, excuse me, very high in selenium. But, if that is a trigger of histamines for you, then, taking selenium in, some sort of supplement. Actually, we have in our Black Label finished products, we have Detox Optimizer, which has these precursors. So also making sure that you have your antioxidant support, reduce the oxidative stress on your cells, on your tissues. So having things, foods first, high in vitamin C, E, quercetin, like Dr. Stephanie had mentioned, alpha lipoic acid, and then, kind of moving into supplementation. So those are ways that you can support definitely the glutathione conjugation pathway. As for COMT, with a slow COMT, again, this is in support of your methylation pathway. So your dark leafy greens, foods with B vitamins, and then based on the rest of your DNA tests, looking at your SHMT1 gene or your MTR gene, that can help you determine which forms of folate, B9, or cobalamin B12 you should be taking to help support that. And of course, magnesium. COMT activity is magnesium dependent. So you need to make sure you're getting enough magnesium. So.
And let's talk about magnesium for a minute, because there's a lot of salt forms of magnesium.
Yes.
Do you have certain salt forms that you like for autoimmunity? I mean, I know I have certain ones for the brain and certain ones for bowels and certain ones, but for autoimmunity or histamine reactions, which salt form would you recommend?
I've never really considered or thought about a form of magnesium specifically for histamines or
I
autoimmunity.
haven't either. That's why I didn't know if you had a trick up your sleeve that I.
Yeah.
3 and 8 I use for brain. Oxide you can use for bowel. Carbonate you can use for bowel or sleep.
Malate, good for, vasculature, brain 3 and 8, for brain. I mean, there's a lot of different forms. Yeah, I mean,
citrate, not unless you're trying to clear your bowels out.
unless you're constipated.
Yeah, exactly.
Need a little help.
I was just trying to think. I would say I would probably stay with a malate, a 3 and 8, just because it gets more deeper into the tissues and works with the energy cycles.
I know bisglycinate is easier on the stomach. So yeah, I don't have anything in particular,
We will for next time.
Yeah, I'll have to look into that and see if there's any literature on it.
Right. I think we answered some of the MTHFR that Deborah was asking. Jennifer said she didn't see anything on the reports about Hashimoto's or hyperthyroid. There is a lot that goes around hyperthyroid, but our report, excuse me, doesn't address, a specific autoimmunity, more the different genes based on lactose intolerance or gluten intolerance or detoxification pathways. Again, if you're new to the DNA company, we have 73 genes that are actionable. There are way more genes out there, but we have chosen to do ones that we can come in with a symptom, have an action, have a result, and then have you change that and see that. What's the difference between mast cell activation syndrome and gluten or histamine intolerance? Gluten intolerance, which I'm used to talking to, no, histamine intolerance, sorry.
Well, it really gets into the mast cell activation is more specific because they are much more sensitive. You can think of them, well, they're big cells and they break open and they release all the histamines. So where the mast cell activation, that's the sensitivity where they release a lot of histamines. So that's more so where the specific comes in. They're both conditions involving histamine, but it's more so in the root causes, I would say, and how they affect the body. So, okay, let me formulate the best, easiest way to express this. So mast cell activation occurs when the mast cells, okay, they're overactive, like I was saying, release an excessive amount of histamines and other chemical mediators. Because they don't just release histamines; they also have cytokines, prostaglandins, and all this other stuff. But they do it inappropriately, just too much. Types of symptoms that can include like flushing, hives, itching, gastrointestinal issues, low blood pressure, heart palpitations, fatigue, headaches, things like that. It can also cause anaphylaxis in severe cases. So it's often diagnosed through a combination of like clinical history, lab tests, and a measurement of elevated levels of mast cell mediators like tryptase, prostaglandins, that I had mentioned, histamine, and that can be done through blood or urine. But again, it's more of that full picture. So there's that aspect. Now, histamine intolerance. This really occurs when there's an imbalance between histamine levels and the body's ability to break them down. So again, what we've talked about from the top when we're talking about the genes that are involved. So this is your DAO, diamine oxidase. What is the level of that? And, how well are histamines being metabolized? And of course, histamines can be measured. So when you're talking about like the diagnoses, measuring DAO levels in the blood, or by observing certain symptoms that, like after the elimination of histamine-rich foods from the diet, you can actually, take a look at that. But
it's really more of a medical diagnosis. And histamine intolerance can be a real gray area. The mast cell activation can get into cardiovascular, heart palpitations, and that has to be diagnosed by a physician. So
yes.
that is a medical diagnosis, where food allergies, histamine allergy, a lot of that is given kind of some poo-poo sideline kind of stuff. But mast cell activation syndrome is an actual medical diagnosis, and it's a dysregulation of the mast cells and their ability to at any time just basically come crashing down on people due to a number of different things. It can be foods, supplements, chemical sensitivities, and the inability to detox. So it's really a severity type thing from my understanding. Yeah. Carol said she was prescribed vitamins and probiotics that had fermented foods, and they almost did her in. Fortunately, she did her research and found out Thank you, Carol, for sharing. Yeah, you've got to be careful what you put in your body. A lot of people will just pop something in their body and not think about it. Read those labels, read those labels, read those labels. And things that are fermented or MSG or where it says yeast substitutes, be very careful about those. Lynn asked, did I miss gluten in pasta? You talked a little bit about grains being, I think, okay in some of the lists. I'm not sure about the gluten being a histamine trigger.
Well, I mean, I would say gluten oftentimes it can and is related to gut issues and thyroid issues because of the zonulin, and you can always get those kinds of things tested, and um, there's a Zoomer test and others that can actually measure that. But yeah, I would try to stay away from that if you have autoimmune issues or major sensitivities. Again, we don't want to be, poking that bruise any more than necessary.
Mhm. So one of the next questions, Rivera Baxon, it says, does it trigger histamine release or autoimmune disorder? I'm actually not familiar with River Baxon. But as a pharmacist, let me look up and see if I can pull it up real quickly. And I'll let you go to one of the next questions while I pull it up and see if I can look at a histamine reaction with that.
Sure. Actually, there was a couple up above. Let me take a look. Let me scroll back up. Okay, so it looks like Stephanie was asking, well, I mean, actually, this kind of touches on the gluten thing and Hashimoto's, because she said, since we're talking about autoimmune and so much is out there about gluten and Hashimoto's, we did touch on this a little bit, but just kind of getting in there. It's, again, really important not to poke that bruise, not to have more of a situation where you can trigger these autoimmune responses, especially if you have more of a susceptibility, because, especially with gluten and Hashimoto's, there's that molecular mimicry where the body confuses gluten proteins, specifically gliadin, with thyroid tissue. So that's what I was, talking about, with zonulin and these other measurements and other things that you can do. But also because histamines and the gut, okay, very interrelated. You have to consider gluten and gut permeability, leaky gut. If, gluten is known to increase intestinal permeability, and that can definitely lean into and predispose, or have someone who is predisposed to autoimmune conditions to increase the likelihood of leaky gut. And if you have leaky gut, you have leaky brain. So again, it's just exacerbating the problems. So really taking a foundational, proactive response to your diet, lifestyle, stress reduction, lowering your toxic load, or those triggering factors, whether it be foods or your environment. I mean, I know my sister had terrible allergies and terrible mold exposures, to the point that she probably would have died if she stayed here in the Northeast. She ended up moving to Arizona in that more dry weather. Absolutely changed her life, changing that environment. She didn't have the allergy. She was able to get off the nebulizers and all of the medications and everything else. So sometimes it's as drastic as maybe you have to move.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So it's funny, I didn't know that Rivarox Roxaban bleh, was Xarelto. I work with Xarelto all the time. So it does talk that Xarelto has a lot of sensitivities, allergic reactions, and it can interact with medicines, foods, dyes, preservatives, and can stimulate anaphylaxis. So if you have been on Xarelto and have noticed an uptick in your autoimmunity or an uptick in your allergic symptoms, it does appear that it triggers it. So because there's not a generic on it, we just always call it Xarelto. So I wasn't aware of the generic name. So thank you for bringing that to my attention. Okay, so we've got Pamela says I have very low IgG. I use it to fuse it to sub-Q every week, but I stopped because the spike protein in the blood products. So my IgG is low. My allergies are crazy. I live on antihistamines. I'm concerned about brain health. Are there supplements that could help with increasing my IgG?
That's a very specific.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think we have the ability to probably address that. The biggest thing that I would say to you is you're on the right track with your prebiotics. I would also look at colostrum. But I would say you need to work with a very specific provider to go into that. We just don't spend a lot of our time on the immunoglobulins, the IgGs or IgMs. So much of what we're doing is taking the pathways that we test and then helping you manipulate those pathways to optimize your health. But this gets into some stuff that's real specific that I would work with your provider on. Yeah. Are you fans of lutein?
Luteolin
Yes.
and sulforaphane.
Yes.
I am.
Yes and yes.
Yes and yes.
Absolutely.
So yeah, we've got
Yeah.
a lot of questions here. So let's see.
Well, we've got just a couple more minutes, so I think a lot of them kind of repeat and we've been able to get through. We'll see if we can grab one or two more. And then obviously, I have never seen this many questions on any of our talks. So obviously, we're going to have to learn more about how to serve our histamine community and support not only the autoimmune with histamines, but our environment with histamines. I know we have a couple more histamine webinars coming up with different angles, but I can tell you I'm going to need to brush up on my histaminic activity because mine has all gone away, and so I don't have to deal with it anymore.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I do see how Alexis asks, can you explain how undermethylation and histamine go together? Well, for individuals who are undermethylated, they tend to have higher histamine levels because their body cannot efficiently methylate or degrade the histamine. So this condition is sometimes used as an indirect indicator of methylation status. High histamine levels, they're often seen in people with low methylation activity, if they have the genetic susceptibility or genetic presentation of dysregulated MTHFRs genes. And, because we have what, six, seven genes that we look at in the methylation pathway. So if you are dysregulated in any of those genes, there's going to be some hiccups in that pathway. So, for that, like when you're talking about high histamine levels, again, which are often seen in people with low methylation activity, they can experience things, that are associated with both undermethylation and histamine intolerance, anxiety, irritability, allergic reactions, things like that. So it really is a matter of, supporting that methylation pathway, recognizing symptoms you may have, but, get your DNA done, look at triggering factors, keep a record of foods or exposures, how you react. You are your own science experiment, and scientists, as scientists, we take a lot of notes. So you've got to be able to follow, what you've been doing, how that is reacting to you and where you want to go, and not keep repeating the same things because you forgot or, oh, I can't remember exactly. If you really want to make the changes, you have to know where you've been and what works and what doesn't.
And you have to be willing to try. As I'm looking through the rest of the questions, I see a lot of things. Should I try a young cheese and not an aged cheese? Should I try liver? Because my functional medicine doc says, they want me on liver. Sometimes you just have to try, and if you're concerned, then maybe they can give you a sample, or maybe you can get a small pack and try a little bit. I always prefer food over supplements. But if you can't get a high quality food, then get a high quality supplement. Um, and, again, a lot of this is test your DNA to know your detoxification paths. And you get a lot of the answers in there that says, hey, you can use glutathione, you can't use glutathione. You need a methylated B, you don't need a methylated B. Can you use an antihistamine short term? Sure, you can use one short term. But then look at the gut health, look at the probiotics, look at stinging nettle tea, look at quercetin. You can always use Dr. Google and do what are some natural alternatives for histamines or antihistamines. A big part of this, as it was for Dr. Lara, as it was for me, was we had to see, the experts say, the literature says, but did that work for me? Sometimes it's trial and error. And I invite you all to earn a PhD in your own health, in the health of your family, in the health of just what is going to work for you. Some people will say that absolutely is not what the literature says. And it's like, but it works for me and I feel better on it. So I really invite you to take what you can from your DNA, take what you can, what you've learned tonight. There were so many of you that were so new. Hopefully, between what you've gotten here and what you're going to get in our follow up, will put you just a step further. For all of you who were intermediate or for experts, we apologize if we didn't meet your needs. Hopefully, we did. But it again, this is about taking those genes. We are expanding our offer of genes. I know we're going to have another 10 sometime before the end of the year, I think. So we'll have like 83 or 85 genes that we'll be covering. That will be exciting for any of you who already have your DNA test. Those will be updated in your report. You'll get those at no additional cost. I know that they're always working on the next set that we have that are actionable, that we can really do something with. The final question I see is Barb is asking about the PEMF mats. I have 3 of the mats. None of mine have ever been $100 or less from Amazon. I think my cheapest one is 2,500 and my most expensive one was 7,000. All of them work really well. And the ones that I use are by professional companies that are made for healthcare providers. There's a lot of really good PEMF information, and there are people that will compare them all brand to brand. But if you really want a decent one that's going to do something, you've got to spend probably 2,000 to 2,500 minimum in order to get that. Now, do you need all the bells and whistles? Absolutely not. But $100 mat, I don't think you're going to get what you're looking for. So, and with that, we have hit the end of our time. I am so appreciative for everybody who stayed to the end. And for those of you who had to leave, hopefully you get to watch the replay and you'll get to get the information that we're sending out. We thank you for your time. We thank you for your dedication, your health, and allowing us to be part of that health journey. And we want you to earn that PhD in you and make sure that you can be the best you can be. Dr. Lara, thank you for being here tonight. And I will send you those references later so that you can have some of your late night study.
Yes. And for anyone who does have questions or didn't have their questions answered, please toss an email to our, I think it's client care, or if our angels in the background can drop in the chat an email that they can send that to. We want to make sure that you are getting what you need from us as far as information, education. Also, if you are watching the replay and you have some questions for this, please, first of all, like, subscribe, but, down on the bottom, in the chat, ask your questions. They get sent to us, we answer them, they get responded to. So, we definitely want to make sure that you are accumulating all the education that you want and need. And we appreciate every single one of you. We are here because of you. So thank you. And Dr. Stephanie, you are awesome. I love doing these with you. And I'm sure we will be doing many more.
We will. Good night. Take care. God bless. Be well.